How's everybody doing? Well, we're going to talk for the next few weeks about fear and anxiety. Just want to say a warm welcome again to those of you that are watching online across our campuses, Middleville and Delton. So glad to have you with us. I must have been about 12 years old, and my dad decided to start a competition in our house over which one of us could scare the other worse. And I think I had the lead until one day my mother got in on the action. And it was about 9 o'clock at night, and I knew that the washer and the dryer had been going downstairs, and so my mom said, "Hey, Dan, I'd like you to go downstairs meaning the basement, which was not finished." And she said, "Would you get the laundry out of the dryer?" So here's what you have to know. The stairs to our basement, there was storage underneath. And so when you'd go up the stairs, you could look under the toe kick and see through to the storage. So I walked downstairs, I got all the stuff out of the dryer, I put it into the basket, and proceeded to make my way up the stairs. And about a quarter of the way up, my father, who had been hiding under the stairs, reached under the space in the stairs and grabbed my feet. I'm certain that at the ripe age of 12, there were some unchurched words that left my mouth because he scared me to death. And here's what's funny. Maybe you can relate to this. To this day, I do not like going down the basement stairs at night. We all have things that we're afraid of. We have fears, things that make us anxious. We have things that bring about anxiety. And some of those, honestly, are irrational. How many of you remember when cordless phones came out? I'm talking the ones in the house. Remember you'd pick that thing up, you'd pull out the long antenna. My grandparents were like the first to have one of these. And I remember being at their house in a thunderstorm. My grandmother would say, "You can't answer that phone in a thunderstorm." Like, did anybody ever get struck by lightning by a Casio cordless phone? I don't know of anybody. Or walking around in the dark. What changes after you turn the light on other than light, right? Or swimming in the ocean at night. What's the difference between swimming in the ocean at night and swimming in the ocean at the daytime? Okay, light, but something starts to happen in our minds that tells us, right, that something could be going on, and we start thinking something is real that really isn't even there. I mean, in today's day and age, I see this all the time with, people who are glued to their social media, and they're afraid, like, who's noticing, who's reading, who's liking, who's doing this and who's doing that. And, you go to school, or if you're a student, you're wondering, who's going to be the bully? Am I going to be accepted? Am I going to be liked? And all of that. And these are really real things that people deal with. What's your most irrational fear? What's the thing that's just holding you back? See, fear has kind of a scale, if you will. And on one side of it are the people who have no fear. Have you ever met anybody who simply was not afraid of anything? I had a buddy that I went to college with that would do things I would never, ever think about doing. He was afraid of nothing. And that's because science would teach us that this little thing in his brain called his amygdala, and that's the thing that tells you to be afraid, I don't think he had one. Or his was simply broken. That's one side of it. On the other side of it, have you ever met somebody that seemingly is afraid of everything? Everything causes them fear and anxiety. Somewhere is the middle 80%. Those of us that have things in our life that cause us to become anxious. Can I just say something to you? Is it fair for me to say that the events of the last year, let's face it, this is a different Easter than last year, isn't it? At least I know for me, I was celebrating Easter watching myself on a screen at our church in New York because we were not meeting. This is a different Easter. And here's what I want to ask you. Is it safe to say that many people have maybe dealt with more anxiety over this last year than maybe at other times in our lives? So what are we supposed to do with that? That's what I'd like us to unpack over the next few weeks. Because I think it's very real to what you and I are going through right now. And you may think, well, what does that have to do with Easter? Just stay with me here. And I think that we're going to unpack that. And I think before we get into that, we need to ask, what is fear? Why is it a part of our life? What's the problem with it? And then what can we do about it? And so here's where we're going. This week, we're going to look at the fear of the future. Next week, we're going to talk about the perpetual anxiety that we feel in the present moment. And then in week 3, we're going to talk about the problem with the past, how some of what you and I have gone through is sort of determining the fears that we have today and the fears that we look forward with. And then the last week, the 4th week, we're going to talk about the challenge of navigating grief. And some of you have navigated grief in this last season, and it's painted a whole nother layer onto all of this. But here's what I'd like to do. First, let's answer this question. What is fear? What is fear? So I'm going to give you my best crack at this to provide kind of a working definition for us that will set the stage for where we're going to go for the next few minutes. Fear is an emotion, right? I'm feeling something. Something's churning within me. It's causing me to shake a little bit. It's causing me to be concerned, to maybe be trepidatious or cautious about what's happening. Fear is an emotion that's caused by the belief. Something in my belief system says, if I do this, this is what's going to happen. You and I have a belief system that dictates what we do. If I believe something's going to unfold a certain way or happen a certain way or end a certain way, it determines what I'm feeling in the moment. Fear is an emotion caused by the belief of looming potential loss. What am I going to lose if I walk into this? Or a lack of control. What's going to happen if I walk up to that group of students for the first day of school and they reject me or they make fun of me? What's going to happen if I walk into that job and I can't perform? What's going to happen if that financial deal goes wrong and I lose everything? What's going to happen if I show up to that church and I move my family all the way across the country and at the end of the day, they don't like me? These are the things that we go through and we rehearse them in our minds, right? Because it might mean loss or it might mean a lack of control. And here's the thing. This is what we ought to really be afraid of. What has fear kept you from doing? What has fear kept you from doing? What could you have walked into, maybe even that God has for you, and your fear has said, I'm not touching that? Or why don't we look at it this way? What has fear caused you to do? What decisions have you made because of your fear? Think about fear this way. If fear had its way, where would it take you? Anybody ever watch the show Hoarders? I'm mesmerized by this show, all right? And essentially, really what's happened is there are folks that have seemingly been through some kind of a trauma in their lives. And what's happened is they have this belief system that says every single thing that I have has value, and I can't get rid of any of it. And so what happens is it gets to the point where people are putting themselves in danger by living in situations where, in some cases, they can't even move through their homes. They're stepping over or sleeping on top of feet of stuff. Maybe if fear had its way, you'd walk everywhere you went because you're not going to get into a car. Or maybe you couldn't eat out. Maybe you just wouldn't go out at all. Or maybe you wouldn't even engage a relationship because in your mind, it always ends bad. Why would I take that chance again? And maybe you'd have missed a relationship or a job or an opportunity. But do you notice that Do you notice that fear is always about something I might lose in the future? It's always about something I could lose in the future, or something I'm afraid I won't have in the future, even control. And I think understanding fear is the first step to overcoming it. So I came across kind of a pyramid, a model of fear that a psychologist put out some years back, and I love it because I think it shows you and I kind of where our fear comes from. And I want to walk you through that today, and I want you to see it because maybe you'll see some of that in yourself, like I see some of it in myself. See, at the top of all of our fear, if you will, is the stuff that has to do with our ego. It's the stuff about failure and insignificance and humiliation. Like, how many of you, if I were to say to you, come and stand on this stage next week and talk for 35 minutes, that would scare you to death, right? Of course. Let me tell you about the first time that I had to preach. Let me tell you about the first time I preached here. My stomach was in knots. Because what are you thinking? What if I don't say the right thing? What if there's rejection? What if I humiliate myself? What if it just nobody resonates with it? We have those things in everyday life. What if they don't like me? What if they don't want to talk to me? What if I embarrass myself? It was 1998, and I was a double major in college in music and Bible. And my application of my music degree was vocal performance. And one of the things that we had to do our senior year is we had to give a recital. And you'd invite your family, you'd invite your friends, and the entire faculty would be there. And you would perform whatever your medium was. Mine was singing, so it was about an hour's worth of music, and there was a reception afterwards. And so I was prepared, ready to go, suit the whole 9 yards, and I was nervous. I mean, like, this is a big deal. And one of my professors, who was known for being a jokester, just as I'm walking out on the stage, as everybody's clapping to welcome me, he leans over and says, "Psst, your zipper's down." Do you know what happened that entire performance until the intermission? All I could think about was the fact that, are all these people looking at me, right? So now, here's what happens. You go through something in your life that's mildly traumatic, and it impacts everything, because you know what I do? Every time I get on stage, you know what I check? Use your imagination. Because we have these ego things, right? Then we have the separation fears. Am I going to be single? Am I going to be alone? Am I going to lose that loved one? Am I just going to be by myself? Will anybody walk through this with me? Then you take it to the next level, and it's the stuff about autonomy. Don't tell me what I can and can't do with the things that belong to me. Don't touch my nest egg. Don't mess with my retirement. Don't screw around with the economy and all of that. It all comes down to, like, don't take the things away from me that I can control. You might be that person that says, anytime I'm in the car, I've got to be the one that's driving, right? But fundamentally, to all of that, the baseline thing that drives all of our fears is the fear of death. That's why people are afraid of snakes or heights or flying. I'm not going to put myself in a situation where potentially I could lose my life. All of those things involve future loss. Fear is a thing that's seeking control. And when we disassociate from it, we disconnect ourselves from it, we can begin to see it for what it is, and we can start to deal with it how we ought to. There's a word that seems completely unrelated to fear, but I have to tell you, it has my attention, and it's where I want to take us for the next few minutes, and it's this word: love. Love. There's a guy in the New Testament of the Bible, the second half, if you will, of the scriptures. There's 66 books, 39 in the Old and 27 in the New. And the 27 in the New are marked at the beginning with the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are all guys that walked with Jesus. They watched his life. And I'm thankful for one that they wrote about what they experienced and what they saw, because we have that today to understand the life of Jesus. One of those guys was a guy by the name of John. And the scriptures teach us that John was actually pretty close to Jesus. You know, they had a special bond, a special friendship. And he writes this, when you think about this idea of love and fear, I love this. He says this, there is what? 2 words, say it. There is no fear in love. There's no fear in love. What do love and fear have to do with each other? They're completely opposite. But here's the deal. How many of you watching online and across our campuses, how many of you have ever seen the Superman movies? What was the one thing that would render Superman completely useless? Say it. Kryptonite. Here's the thing that John is saying. He's saying that love is the kryptonite for fear. Love is the kryptonite for fear. In fact, he says this, there's no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Perfect love drives out fear. Here is the question this Easter weekend, 2021. Where do you and I go to find perfect love? Watch. Perfect love is the love of God, extended to you and extended to me in Jesus Christ. I grew up as a boy going to a Christian boys' camp in the heart of the Adirondacks, and I loved it. It just molded and shaped me, the men there that poured into my life. And one of my favorite things about camp was every night we would have a campfire. And we would gather, everybody from camp would gather on the banks, on the shore of the lake that the camp was on. And there would be music, and there would be skits, and there would be stories. But here's what you have to know. In the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, in the woods, on the water, there's something that happens right around dusk every night. And it's this. The mosquitoes come out. And you would make it a point before campfire to put long sleeves on, put jeans on, pull your socks up over your jeans, and then spray yourself with bug spray. And what would happen is the bug spray would drive the bugs away. It did not kill them. They were the norm. They were there to stay. But it drove them away. Here's what I want you to see. God's love is fear repellent. The deeper you and I go into experiencing the fullness of the love of God, the more that the fear in our lives is driven away. The power of God's love renders the control of fear absolutely powerless. It's like that hoarder, right? That fills their house with so much stuff that there's no more room to live. God's love takes up so much space in your life and in mine that fear no longer has room to thrive. God's powerful love creates fearless people. There's a guy in the New Testament, that's that second half that we talked about, and his name is Paul. And so many of the letters that we have in the New Testament were written by his hand. So much of what we've learned to know and understand about God and the way he works comes from the hand of Paul and even from the Gospels. But prior to Paul experiencing God, let me tell you a little bit about his life. Paul was a Pharisee, very well educated, knew the law better than anybody. He was hyper religious, could give an answer. But he was also a bit of a terrorist. Because Jesus comes on the scene and begins to change the world. And this guy, Paul, hears about it. And he goes to the powers that be and says, look, this Christianity thing, which was called the Way, is picking up steam, and we've got to put an end to it. So here's what I'd like you to let me do. Let me go from city to city, and I will instill so much fear in these followers of the Way that they'll stop what they're doing, and we'll begin to reestablish the balance of power that we have as the religious right and as the government, that we're kind of working hand in hand to keep the power base alive. As he would go from city to city, torturing, making a statement, in some cases putting Christians to death, as if to say, this thing needs to stop. And one day, on his way to a place called Damascus, a city called Damascus, he's riding his horse, and he's thrown off by a light that appears. And it throws him down, and it begins to speak to him. And we learn from reading it that light was actually the presence of Jesus himself. And Paul knows it. It blinds him. And he goes and he stays at this guy's house till he gets a message that this guy that was going to be cranking up fear everywhere he went is now going to bring life and momentum to the message of Jesus, unlike anything we've ever seen in the world. And so what he does is he goes all around the Mediterranean rim, and he starts churches in places like Ephesus and Colossae and Galatia. And then as he starts these churches, he hands them off to leaders, but then he goes back and he writes them letters. So in the New Testament, if you open that up and you go to like Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, all of those are actually letters that he wrote to churches that he helped to get started. And one of them was in the epicenter of power of that day. It was the Church of Rome. And he wrote a letter to them, and this is what he says to them: who will separate us from the love of Christ? See, here we're going to start to see how fear and love are connected. Perfect love drives out fear. He says, will trouble or hardship or persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword, see the ego and all of that coming out in this trouble, hardship, the sword, famine, nakedness. He goes, here's it as it's written, for your sake, we're facing death all day long. Funny, the guy that's going around from city to city putting people to death is now afraid for his life because he's spreading this message of the Way. He's saying, all day long, we're considered a sheep to be slaughtered. And you know why? Because we're going from city to city, and we're proclaiming this guy that predicted his death and resurrection and pulled it off. That's what makes this an Easter message. These guys are out there talking about the very thing that you and I are celebrating today, a risen Savior named Jesus. He goes on, he says, no, in all these things we are, say those three words, more than conquerors through him who loved us. We don't need to just deal with our fears. In the love of Jesus, we can wipe them out. So what can separate us from the love of God? Nothing. Nothing. He writes this, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present or the future or any powers, neither height nor depth, anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ our Lord. My friends, the cross and the resurrection have the last word every single time. Every time. Your fear ought to tremble when it knows what it's up against. It's up against a Savior that conquered death and offers every one of you sitting in the room, sitting across our campuses, watching online. There is nobody that you will ever lock eyes with for whom Jesus did not lay down his life for. So what do you do with our fear? The fear of failure and insignificance and humiliation. What does love do to that? Love says you matter. Every one of you, you matter to God. What about separation or being alone? Or what happens if I'm all by myself? Jesus comes along and he says, I love you. I will never leave you or forsake you. You will never have to worry about being alone. I'll never leave you. What about loss and what if this goes away? And he says, you can trust me. I'll supply every one of your needs. I will make sure you never not have what you need. Well, what if I lose my life? For God so loved the world that he gave his son, that whoever would believe in him would have everlasting life. Jesus defeated death. He conquered the grave. Do you know he was not the first Messiah to come along and say that he was the Savior of the people? There were many. But he was the one who not only predicted his death, but predicted his resurrection and pulled it off. So that guy, Paul, he continues to write. He says, so what then shall we say in response to these things? I love this. If God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for you, who can be against you? How about this? If God is for me, there is no fear that can rule me. If God is for me, there is no fear that can rule me. Here's what I want you to see. God's love doesn't just defeat fear. God's love obliterates fear. In fact, let's take it a step further. God's love gives fear something to fear. That is the message of the empty tomb. Jesus conquered the grave. And because he conquered the grave, there is nothing that can separate you from the love of God. Nothing that you and I need to be afraid of. We can walk confidently as sons and daughters of God. But you know where the enemy plays with us, right? Right here. He plays with us in our minds. We have to remind ourselves of who we are and whose we are. That every one of you sitting at Middleville and Delton and Hastings and watching online, you may have to wake up in the morning and tell yourself, I'm deeply loved by God. You need to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Because here's what I want you to know. And here's why God gave his son, for you and I to have life. And why he conquered death and the grave. Because if there's one thing that I've learned, the best you is the most fearless you. When you are not gripped by fear and anxiety and worry, you'll walk boldly into what God has for you. Who makes that possible? Jesus makes that possible because he conquered the greatest foundation to our fear, and that's death. And he's inviting you tonight to follow him. I'd love for you to bow your heads with me for a moment. And I really believe that there may be some of you sitting here today or sitting in Middleville or sitting in Delton or watching online, and the Spirit of God is saying to you, I want you to open your arms and your heart and receive the love that I have for you. I do not want you bound by fear and worry and anxiety. I want you to be free of that. And that freedom comes in Jesus. And maybe in this moment today, you would say, God, I'm tired of being afraid. I'm putting my life in your hands. Teach me to live again.